All right. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Flask, and we're going to be covering this next series of topics. So we'll cover, well, what is a web server? What's its topic? What's its purpose? What is Flask, and how can we create a server with Flask? Um, so to start off the lecture, we've talked about a couple of different battle rhythms when it comes to, not battle rhythms, but I guess order of operations when it comes to how web development works, right? So let's go ahead and open up TLDraw here and kind of talk about what's happening. So I'm on TLDraw right now. I'm trying to figure out where exactly we're at. So the first day, we covered HTML and CSS, right? So HTML and CSS, otherwise referenced to as which portion of our full stack development. Is this the front end, back end?
Front end.
Right, which is generally referenced to as the front end, right? This is what the user sees. So user sees and interacts with. Okay, great. And then yesterday we covered our database, which I'm going to do in this, right? Which is going to be Postgres. Okay, now Postgres, that kind of falls within our backend framework, right? It's not something that the user interacts with, so therefore it's part of the backend. So the user does not interact directly with the database. Now, the keyword here is directly, right? Because data needs to be saved to the database. That's going to happen through user interactions. But the user is never going to insert SQL queries or do any type of logic to actually interact with our database directly. We'll take care of that for the user. All we're going to have in our front end is some sort of form for the user to submit. That way we can update the data in our database. Okay. So now we've talked about our Postgres, which is one side of this spectrum here, right? It's our database. It's where we maintained all of our users' data. And we've talked about our front end, which is, our HTML and CSS, what our user sees, what they're able to interact with, things that they're able to click on or go on to next pages, right? Well, how do these two connect? What's happening in between them, right? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So today, we're going to be talking about servers. And in this case, we're going to be building a Python server with Flask. So we'll say Flask server. This is also part of our backend because the user does not interact with it. And the purpose of the Flask server is to accept requests from the front end and return responses to the front end. All right, so now let's talk about a practical example. What exactly does this mean? So let's say I log on to Facebook, right? So user logs on to Facebook, and let me try to put this in a different color here. And gold works. Okay, so user logs on to Facebook. Now, let's say I'm somewhere where there's a low internet connection. What do I typically see when I log on to Facebook and there's a low internet connection?
It'll load like a skeleton, kind of like a low bandwidth
Yeah, I could load
version.
it, or sometimes I see like a little spinning wheel, right? Saying like, hey, there's something loading. We don't necessarily have something yet, but yeah, it will load a skeleton. It just has no content, right? And in the middle of that skeleton, there's that annoying spinning wheel that's just spinning, waiting for me to get data. Okay, well, what's happening on the background is our front end, meaning when I go to facebook.com and it loads it, JavaScript is actually sending a request to the backend. Okay, now that request could look like many different things. Let's assume that I'm in the home page. More than likely, what it's asking for is it's asking me to provide. So let's say it says all posts, right? Some sort of endpoint that goes along this way. So this is definitely not what it is, but let's say that if they had an API that was public, it would look something like HTTPS, facebook.com/all posts, right? So this is being sent to some sort of web server. And then once that server accepts that request, it looks at the endpoint and it says, oh, okay, you want all post. So then the server is in charge of running some sort of logic. It takes that endpoint and says, you want all the posts pertaining to this user. So then at this point, the server communicates to our database. Okay, server accepts and returns, accepts request, returns a response. All right, so now when it talks through that database, what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, I need all of the posts pertaining to this one individual that I can show onto their timeline. So that sounds like something like select all from posts where user.id and friends, right? Something along these lines. This is definitely a dirty example of what a SQL query would look like. Then at the end, there would be something like a semicolon. Okay, so it asks for that information. The database grabs that query and says, oh, okay, that's what you want. If it's a valid query and there's actual information, then it'll return something, right? So it returns a list of objects representing the result of said query. Okay, so it returns that list of objects. It goes back to the server. The server is then in charge of grabbing that list of objects and turning it into something that's JSON readable. Well, why would I want to turn something that comes out from an SQL query into something that's JSON readable before I return it to my front end? Can anyone think of any ideas as to why that is?
You can like ensure it's formatted a certain way, I guess, or you know what values you're like expecting in the program. So I guess if you had different teams, you could tell them like, hey, expect this type of data to be worked with or whatever.
Yeah,
And
that's. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you still talking?
no, that's pretty much it.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, it's a great explanation. It definitely goes along with formatting the data and making sure that the data has some sort of consistency, right? But the main purpose behind turning it into JSON is because when we communicate with our front end and our back end, our front end is typically running back JavaScript. The majority of the time, it's always going to be utilizing JavaScript to try to communicate with the backend framework or some sort of API. Now, with that said, JavaScript and the language of the web in general is JSON. It's waiting for you for any type of interchangeable data between HTTP requests or HTTP responses to be in JSON format and JSON format only. So then the server grabs this response. It does some logic, whatever that logic is, to make sure that it's formatted properly and that it's in a JSON format. And then it returns that list, right? But now instead of this list looking like a query set or something that just came straight out from the database, that list looks like this. It looks like list ID 1, post, and then maybe it has the actual post, and then person, that probably has the person who posted it. So say Michael, and then likes, 0.2 likes, and comments. And then that probably has a list of dictionaries and so on. All right. And that's how this continues to open up over and over and over again until the JSON data is completed. And let me kind of grab that here so that it looks better. Okay. So once this information gets returned and it goes back into my front end, how does this information get rendered on the screen, right? Well, at that point, JavaScript is actually what manipulates our DOM, which is the document object model. And we'll learn about that here shortly. But JavaScript will grab this information and turn it into HTML content that actually shows up on our screen and gets rendered on our screen. And that's how this cycle works, right? So the user logs on, a request gets sent to the server. The server then may or may not communicate with the database to grab the information needed. In this case, it does. So it sends a query to the database. The database returns a list of database queries, the query set that's returned from the data. Then the server formats that data so that it's in the correct order. It's all in the same consistent order, and it's all in JSON format. Then it returns a JSON response over to our front end to allow JavaScript to work with that JSON response and render HTML content on the user's web page. Right? And that's the entire purpose here. So far we covered HTML and CSS. We've covered Postgres, and today we're going to focus on building our server. First, we'll build a server in itself that does not communicate with a database. And then in the afternoon, we'll extend our server so that it actually talks to the Postgres database that we built yesterday, and it's able to communicate back and forth and accept requests and return responses. Does anyone have any questions over the subjects that I just spoke about here?
I have a question that's maybe slightly off topic, but I was just wondering, for different pages on the website, are those different HTML files, or is it all the same HTML file?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to say that it kind of depends, right? What's actually being rendered on the screen is going to be different. I don't want to say different HTML files, because that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire template is being changed, right? What you will typically see is that there is one set HTML file, and the content within that one HTML file is what's consistently changing between web pages, right? So it's one HTML file that gets rendered, but then the components within it are interchangeable. Does that make sense, Clarice?
I think so. I probably have to see it in practice.
Yeah, we'll definitely see it more in practice once we get into React, or hopefully once we get into the DOM manipulation, we'll be able to see that a little bit better. All right. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Cody.
Flask is not that old, right? 'Cause I'm wondering what people use before Flask.
I see. Yeah, as far as other frameworks, there's definitely a lot of frameworks that you can utilize to write backend servers. Flask and Django, I don't want to say that they're super new, but they are relatively on the newer side. Python wasn't necessarily the primary language to be able to write a server, but it's become more and more popular. And the reasoning behind that is because Flask is simple and easy to kind of pick up and implement. And Python kind of follows the same exact principles, right? That it's super powerful and it's easy to pick up and implement. But once your project starts growing into something that's large and complicated, and it has a considerable amount of data entries, and you need to consider something like caching and all of these other web concepts whenever you're creating your server, you're going to want to use a different framework than Flask or Django. Not saying that they wouldn't be able to handle it, but there's definitely better frameworks to handle those tasks than Flask or Django. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, it kind of does. And that, because like when you're explaining like Postgres and Flask servers, I'm like reading like a quick paragraph off of Wikipedia just to get like some background history. And it seems like a lot of these things are just like, oddly enough, they're like fun. They're smart dudes who make them as a joke. Actually, their names are kind of like jokes, and it works out. And now here we are.
Yeah, that's what happens when people are smart and having fun, I guess. All right. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. Then we just covered a pretty good portion of our lecture for this morning, right? We talked about the Flask server and we talked about its purpose and why we need a server. So let's get into actually building one. So now let's start with some code. I have this app.py file. I want to create a Flask instance. Well, there's a couple of things that I need to do before I even go into creating Flask. Well, one would be if I tried to run something like Flask or actually let's backtrack a little bit. Whenever we were doing install fest and we had to install JavaScript and we had to install Python, right? Before I had Python on my computer, if I tried to compile some sort of Python script or some sort of JavaScript script before I had Node, my computer would have just gave me an error. It would have told me I have no idea what to do with this information, right? Because my computer has no idea what it's trying to interpret or how to interpret it. So I need to tell my computer that this is going to be a Flask oriented framework and that I need it to install Flask. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and run the command pip install Flask with a capital F at the beginning. And that there will install Flask. Unfortunately, it's already installed in my computer, so it tells me requirements are already satisfied. But in the computers, in all of your computers, it will actually show it being installed through pip. Okay, so now that I have, oh, go ahead.
Should we install that on the virtual environment or on the overall system?
For simplicity's sake, as of today, we're gonna install it in the overall system. On a typical standpoint, whenever you're creating a project, especially with Python, you want to utilize a virtual environment to keep track of your installments. All right. So now I installed Flask, and now I actually want to create a Flask application. Well, before I even create a Flask application, let's talk about the logic here, right? All I simply want to do is kind of something along these lines. Let me show you guys the Pokey API. You guys will get super familiar with this information, but this is all we're creating. We're just creating an API that returns a dictionary. If I look at this in JSON form, we can see that it returns one massive object, right? This is JSON, so these are objects with multiple keys, and those keys can have arrays, and it's just a bunch of nested information that I can utilize here, right? And this is all just pertaining to one Pokemon. If I change something on my endpoint, let's say I look up Charizard, well, then I get the same exact JSON format, right? Everything's in JSON. The server received this request of HTTPS, Pokey API, and this was the endpoint that it got. So it grabbed the endpoint of Charizard and it said, oh, you want to know all of the information about Charizard? Let me query the database to grab this information. So it queries the database, grabs all of this, turns it into JSON format, and then returns it to the front end. And that's what I'm seeing here. This is the response from the server. And I can see that it's returning it all in JSON, it's on objects, and it has keys with value pairs, right? And that's what I want to create today. I want to create my own version of an actual API. So now with that said, before we start getting into actually creating a server, before we start getting into tying it into Postgres and how that's going to work, let's just say that I have this list of students here. And this list of students is in our curriculum. So if you all want to pull it, you guys are more than available to. So I have this list of students. There's 5 students in there. So I got John, Jane, Bob, Emily, and Michael. These are the same students from yesterday coming out from our CSV file, right? Now let's say that I wanted to do something as simple as just returning every single one of these students. Well, how can I do that? All right, I want to create a function that when it gets triggered, it returns the entire list of students. What would that look like?
You said you want all their names, Francisco?
Exactly, yes. I just wanted to return the entire list of students.
Yeah, so just select just the entire list, like all their info, just select star from students.
Yeah, I just want to create a function that returns this list.
So you'd want to like name a function like def and then maybe something like get students. And then you shouldn't really need an input value. So you can just do return students.
Okay, perfect. So there you go. I met my requirements, right? I just wrote a simple function, and it's supposed to return all of my students. Well, let's test it out. Let me go ahead and print get students here. Okay, well, when I run this function, I tell it to print get students because I want to see the return value of this function. And we can see that it's returning the ID. It's actually returning the entire list of students, right? Nothing super complicated. It's all very simple and it's nothing complex. So this is great. Well, now that I can see it in my terminal, how am I supposed to change this so that my HTML template or some sort of JavaScript or application can talk to this program and see this list as well? Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this simple program into a Flask server so that whenever somebody wants to communicate with this information, they can simply just ping an API and get the same information regardless of what platform is using it, right? Because we all have phones, we all have the same applications probably, or some common applications. But when we access those applications, we're all getting the same or a form of the same data, even though we're in different devices. Well, that's because the API is communicating with the same database to grab that information. So let's turn this script into a Flask script here. I'm going to go ahead and say from Flask, I want you to import Flask, and I want to import, and let's just go ahead and import Flask for now. Okay. So I'm importing a class of Flask. How do I know this is a class?
It's capitalized.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's capitalized, right? The F in the very beginning is capitalized, so it tells me that according to Python syntax, this is a class. Another neat trick is that if you if you are on Mac, if you hold down the command and click on the actual import statement of Flask, it's going to open up the file where the class of Flask is being created. And it's going to give you quite a bit of information of what it does, how it works. A lot of the documentation that's already public in Flask is also on here. This is all just commented code. We can see that it's a formatted string. And this is when it starts talking about, hey, this is what happens when you go to create this, this application. And these are all of the default values that come along with it when you go to create a Flask server. Currently, right now, we don't need to go too far in depth about all of this. But the one thing that I would like to cover today is going to be debug. Now, debug is a specific setting or a configuration that you can reference to as to in what state this Flask server is going to be. Now, once something is deployed, would you want clients to be able to see error messages or debugging messages that are trying to help the client fix the server?
No.
No, you wouldn't want that, right? You would want that to be isolated and private. So you would turn this debug into false if you didn't want, if you're on a deployment. If you're deploying, debug would be false. If you're developing, you want debug to still equals true. Okay. So now I imported this class, but how do I initialize this class, right? Can anyone think of a way that I can initialize this class here?
You would need like a name for your like a variable name equals Flask open close parentheses.
Yeah, perfect. So you can definitely start it that way. Something that's common in Python is to use the underscore name, and underscore name, it tells you right here. It's just something static. It doesn't really mean anything. It's utilized as a variable, and it's just referencing to the app, to the title of the file itself. But it's not actually putting anything in there. You could change this to be a specific name. But since I don't really need a specific name at this time, I'm just gonna name it __ name. All right. So now I created a Flask instance. That's great. I have a Flask instance that I can run. I have the data, and I already have the function that I can return. Well, let me try to run this app real quick. Nothing happened, right? I'm initiating an instance, but it's never running. So let's run this app. Let's say app.run. And then here is where I can tell it if I want debug to be true or if I want it to be false. So I'm going to run my app and I'm going to run it so that it's true, that I can get error messages if there's something wrong. Let's run this app. Okay, so I see my print statement is being turned on here. All right, so there's my print statement. And then it gives me a couple of different messages here. So let's see, my print statement happens. It looks like it happens twice. And it tells me, hey, the Flask app is running. It's on debug mode is on. And it's currently running on HTTP 127.0.0.1. What is this right here? This 127.0.0.1. We've seen it before. What is that referencing to?
Is it a port?
Is that your IP address?
Yeah, those are great guesses. So 127.0.0.1 is actually referencing my machine. This is all just my own machine. Now this here, after that colon, that's the port that it's running on. It is running on port 5000, right? So it's telling me, hey, on your local machine, on port 5000, this is where this server is going to be available. And then it looks like it's restarting a stat, and it tells me everything's working well. Okay, well, what happens when I open that up? Let's see here. Well, when I open this up, we see that something gets rendered. It says the request URL was not found on the server. If you entered the URL manually, please check your spelling and try again. So it's telling me that nothing was found, but if we look here, right, it's telling me it received a GET request, and we'll talk about these requests later on and what they mean. But pretty much anytime you request information from something, you're asking to get information from the server, right? So I sent a GET request to my server. I did it through HTTP, and it's telling me how quickly it answered. But then it tells me, hey, there's a 404 error because we couldn't find this specific route. Well, what is a route? How do I define a route? What is it that I want it to do? We know the server is working because this template's coming straight from Flask, right? I didn't create this HTML template, and it's definitely not something that's provided to me by Google or something, right? If I look something up, it refers me to Google and it tells me, hey, there's no such thing in there. I'm trying to think of a way that I can force it. Let's see. Found.com. Let's try something like that. Okay, so it seems like notfound.com belongs to some sort of title thing. Let's see what else I could do here. Oh, that one should work. Okay, there you go. So if I try to go to a site that does not exist, it's going to simply tell me, hey, this site does not exist. And this is coming from Chrome, right? What I'm seeing here is coming from Chrome. It's not an actual HTML template. Chrome is taking care of this for me. But we see that when I go to port 127.0.0.1 at port 5000, it returns to me an HTML template. There's something that's showing up here. Well, this is coming from Flask, right? I can look at the header. We can see the title is not found. I can look at the body. There's an H1 tag for not found, and there's a P tag. And this template, again, is just coming from Flask. So now let's define a route, right? I want to be able to see all of my students. But how can I do that? I can't just do a print statement because a print statement is obviously not working, right? Instead, I want to define a route that would actually return something. So let's do something like this. I'm going to create my decorator with @app, and then I'm going to specify this is going to be a route. I am creating a route for this function. And this function will be triggered anytime this route is visited. So I'm going to go ahead and add the route now. In this case, I just want it to be students. And then I'm going to specify what methods can actually reach this route. For methods, it's going to take in a list because there's a couple of different methods, right? We have, let me go ahead and write that here. We have get, put, post, and delete, which are the 4 type of methods that can be sent to our server or that can be accepted by our server. There's a couple of other ones, but these are the most common utilized for RESTful APIs. So I am requesting information. I am not putting information into the database. I am not posting information on our database, and I am not deleting information from my database. So which one of these methods am I trying to utilize?
Yeah.
Get.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and specify get. Okay, so now it knows. Perfect. So now you want to run this app, right? The app is going to run at the end of it, and it has one route that has been specified. That one route belongs to the students. It's only able to accept the method of a get request, and it's supposed to return the students list. So let me run this again. Okay, it's running. If I go back over to Flask, excuse me, everyone. If I go back over to Flask and I refresh it, we can see the get request goes through, but I still get the not found. Why is that? Why am I getting a not found?
You have to go to the students URL, so /students.
Yeah, it's not going to /students, right? It's just going to, right now, when I specified the /students, what I'm saying is that this route can be reached at HTTP : oh no, I think it's 127.0.0.1 at port 5000/students. This is when this route will get triggered. But currently, the site that I'm on is only HTTPS 127.0.0.1 at port 5000. So let's fix that. Currently, I'm at port 5000. Let me put /students. All right, so I place /students, and when I send my request, we can see that it's returning a list of objects, right? The background is dark, and that's because I have everything on dark mode, so that's why my background is dark and the text is white. For all of you, you should get a white background with dark text, and this is all just JSON readable, right? So now I could open as many tabs, as many browsers as I want, and I can reach the same information and make it accessible to anyone who's trying to communicate with the server. So now there's a problem here. And not necessarily a problem because it's working, right? But it's not working the way that we would want it to. Now, currently I returned a list of dictionaries, which is pretty easy to interpret to something that's JSON readable. And what's happening here is that when we run our Flask server says, oh, you want to return this list of dictionaries, but you forgot to turn it into JSON. Don't worry, I'll convert it for you so that you don't have any errors, right? The program is trying to be friendly and it's trying to say, hey, I'll take care of it for you. No problem at all. Now, what's the problem with that?
If what you're returning isn't JSON friendly, it will return like gobbledygook.
Yeah, exactly. What if I'm returning something that isn't JSON friendly? Or if it assumes that something is supposed to be converted in some specific way, but that's not how I want it to be converted, right? I want to make sure that I'm telling my program as many steps as possible to avoid it from creating any problems, right? Just like we have JavaScript and Python, right? Can I multiply in JavaScript? I'm able to multiply a string or I'm able to add a string of a number to a number, and they would return some magical string with the two numbers connected to each other, right? But the moment I try to subtract it, it freaks out and it tells me, hey, there's a problem. Now, JavaScript is very flexible, and that's great when we're trying to learn and we're implementing these web applications. But I prefer Python because of the fact that if I try to do that in Python, Python tells me, hey, there's a problem here. These are not the same data types. You need to stay within your lane, right? You need to make sure that you handle this, because if I handle it for you, it can create some sort of unexpected behavior. So now I have from Flask, import Flask, and they also have something called jsonify. And they have this method because they know that at some point we're going to want to return JSON data. So all we're going to do is we're going to JSONify our return statement, so that whenever our return statement is triggered, it returns in a JSON format. Okay, so now we ping it one more time. We can see everything is working correctly. If I go back to my server, we can see that my server accepted a successful GET request. So it got a GET request. It went to the endpoint of /students. The request was sent through HTTP, not HTTPS. And it gave me a status code of 200, meaning that the request was successful and it returned a response. All right, we just covered a lot. So let me do a quick recap, and then afterwards we'll take in some questions. All right. So when I want to create a Flask server, I want to make sure that I import Flask from Flask. Once I've done that, I want to initialize the class by assigning it to a variable. And then we just initialize the class as normal as we did in OOP. I have this student array, which is a list, which is a list of dictionaries with each student dictionary within it. Each student dictionary looks exactly like our CSV data. And we're going to see how it works here shortly once we go to connect it to our database. But for now, we'll utilize this list as our source of data. Afterwards, I created a route for this Flask server at the endpoint of students that accepts GET request and GET request only. This route will trigger a function named getStudents, and this function will return a JSON array of this list of students up above. Once we've established the route and we've initialized our actual server, at the end of the script, to make sure that the server runs, I'm going to pass app.run. So app is the class of Flask, and run is a method, right? It is a instance method that belongs to an instance of a Flask server. So I'm going to run that Flask server, and the one attribute that I'm going to pass to this method, or the one parameter that I'm going to pass to this method, is that I want it to be in debug equals true, which will allow me to have debugging messages so that I can fix any errors that I've done in my program. Once I created all this, I can go over to a browser, go to the correct port. So 127001, again, that's my local machine. After the colon, I specify port 5000, which is where my Flask server is running. And then I provide the endpoint of students. Once that request is sent, my server on my local machine will accept the request. It will trigger this function and return the correct JSON readable information that I tell that function to return. And then it will give me a message telling me, hey, we received a request, a GET request at the endpoint of students. It was sent through HTTP, and it gives me a code, which is 200. And in this case, 200 is successful, letting me know that it was able to accomplish the request correctly. So it accepted the request and returned a response. And now I have an API that is able to accept GET requests and return responses. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that I've just covered so far?
I do. It's just like so that I can clarify my understanding. So essentially, a Flask a Flask server is just like a Python application that acts as your in between your like SQL files and your front end.
For now, that's the way we're utilizing it. But it
Okay.
doesn't always have to talk to your database, right? It could simply ping your, maybe there's something that's not in the database, but that's normal and that you already have on your server preloaded. You can also handle errors through your server, and you could handle what type of responses to return for said errors in your server. Does that answer your question, Frank?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cody?
Yeah, the line 16 with the at logo, I don't know what you really call it, ampersand.
The decorator?
Yeah, the decorator. So what this is getting at, and just let me know if I'm completely wrong, is like, are we eventually gonna be putting in things like event listeners, like functions with event listeners and stuff, like when people click on things?
We will, yes. Not
This, like, I'm on this. I'm not.
Oh, go ahead.
I said, am I on the right track?
Yeah, no, definitely. So we could definitely make it to eventually we're going to have it so that our application can send requests, right? My HTML template that gets rendered that my client is interacting with, he can either press a button to send this request and grab this information so that they can render it on the screen.
Cool.
Awesome. Any other questions?
The JSONify, that's just making it like accessible to JSON. Is that what you're saying?
It's essentially working as a translator. So it's taking all of the information that I'm passing into it and turning it into a JSON readable object in case it's not.
So if the object was not like if it was a completely broken object that you were putting in, what would the JSONify do to that?
It would attempt to turn it into something JSON readable. So let's see. How could I say this is not JSON? I wonder what happens if we do this. Let's go. Okay, so it turned it into something that's JSON readable, right? So typically in JSON, what you'll see is a dictionary or a list of dictionaries with a key pair value. But in this case, by utilizing JSONify, it's just going to take that value and interpret it for me so that it's always able to turn it into JSON. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me want to play with what are the limits of that.
Yeah, definitely. Try to break it. Okay. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. This was a pretty simple example. So now let's go ahead and pause the recording here. All right, welcome back, everyone. The next portion of our class is going to be talking about Flask and SQL. We've been able to create each one of the portions of a full stack application individually at this point. All right, we just finished creating a server. Yesterday, we were able to create a database that was able to communicate with CSV files and just interact with data in general through SQL. The day prior to that, we talked about HTML and CSS. And the only portion that we have left to talk about when it comes to our front end is going to be how JavaScript communicates and intertwines all three of these portions. But today, before the end of the day, we're going to talk about how Flask and SQL are going to talk to each other. All right, we created a database and we created a server. And currently right now, our server is grabbing all of its data from a list that I gave to it. That's great and all, but this isn't something that I'm going to be able to utilize for data consistency. Just like we talked about yesterday, the best place to store data is through an RDBMS, right? A relational database management system. So how do we do that? All right. Well, the people who created Flask, they knew that eventually people were going to need a way to talk to a database. So they created a new package named Flask SQL Alchemy. So let's go ahead and install that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and say pip install Flask dash SQL Alchemy. And this is probably my favorite.
Typo, Flask instead of Flask.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so now when I run this, it gives me requirements already satisfied. For you, it's going to go ahead and install this library. So again, the command is going to be pip install Flask SQL Alchemy. And that's going to install SQL Alchemy into my program or my local machine. Now, how do I tell this Python script to utilize SQL Alchemy? Well, now I'm just going to say from Flask SQL Alchemy, I want to import SQL Alchemy. Now the question comes, well, what exactly does this mean, right? What is this providing for me? Well, there's a couple of things here. So SQL Alchemy is just a simple library that will allow me to talk to a database and grab information out from a database. So let's just do a quick review over what we constructed yesterday and talk about how our database looks at this point. I'm going to open up a new terminal and I'm going to enter students. Okay, if I run a /d for relationships in students, I see that I have the student and the student ID sequence table. If I run a query of select all from student, we can see that I have 6 students currently in there. I have John, Jane, Bob, Emily, Michael, and Francisco. So now how do I talk to this database? How do I tell my app that it needs to talk to this database? Well, let's take a look at Flask here. And let's see what it gives me. Where is the config? Okay, so I can see that there's a config attribute here that's being put to work. So let's take a look at self.config. Here's my init method. Here's the super init method. And it looks like self.config has something to do with this config from the init method. All right, well, what is config doing? Unfortunately, it's not going to let me look at exactly what config is doing unless I can find where exactly that configuration file is coming from. But what configuration is doing on the ground is essentially it's allowing me to pass new arguments or new things for this server to consider whenever it's grabbing data or just working overall. So I created my Flask server or my Flask app. And all I'm going to do is utilize the config attribute to tell it, hey, I want you to take the following into consideration now. I want you to utilize SQL Alchemy as a database URI. So now I'm telling my app, my Flask app, hey, SQL Alchemy will be the way that we communicate to our database. Great. So now that it knows that, it needs to know what database is it that we're trying to talk to, right? Well, where is this database located? Where can I find it? So I'm going to go ahead and start telling it the exact place where this database is located. So first I'm going to tell it what database it is. So it's going to be a PostgreSQL database. All right. And this : / is telling it, all right, so I want you to go into PostgreSQL, and this is the user that I want you to enter as. So I myself am the root user. I can see the root users by running /du. And there it tells me my role name is Francisco Avila. I'm a super user and I have all of these abilities. Okay, Great, so I'm gonna go ahead and copy that. I'm gonna paste that here. Now, if you have a password, you can go ahead and provide the password afterwards. So your password would go here. I myself do not have a password, so I do not have to pass in this argument. Right? And then afterwards, I'm going to tell it where on my machine it's located. So it's obviously at localhost because it's within my machine, but where in localhost? Right? So some of you may have multiple databases running. You may have a Postgres, or you may have other databases. Maybe you're using Docker to be able to run your Postgres instance. And if you're utilizing something like Docker, it may not be mapped to the default port of 5432. So instead, you can utilize something like con info. And under con info, you can find out where exactly it's located. So it tells me I am connected to database students. I am the user, Francisco Avila. So I already know that. That's who I am. This database is within my local machine. So it's in localhost. And it tells me that it is at port 5432. So I can specify the port 5432. And then finally, it needs to know what database is it that it's accessing. And in this case, it's students. Right? So now I'm telling it, hey, I create a Flask app. This app needs to take a configuration, and this configuration is going to say, I want you to utilize SQL Alchemy as our function for interacting with our database. And here's the database that I want to interact with. I want you to interact with a PostgreSQL database where the user is Francisco Avila. If there was a password, I would include the password here to ensure that I have proper permissions, but there is no password. And then I would say this database that I want you to enter, or this PostgreSQL database with this user and password, is currently located inside of this local machine. It's in port 5432. And the data table, or the database that I want you to enter, is the students database. Does anyone have any questions up to this point over what we've gone over?
I think it was like a hot topic when we were setting up this originally, with you explaining how to get like your username. Like I put it in the chat actually. If you just look at the chat, it says like when I put in /du, there's Cody and then there's Postgres.
You're on
slightly. Go ahead.
You're on WSL, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So then your question is what?
I mean, yours was Francisco Avila, and it had all of those attributes, whereas like Postgres, like there's Cody and then there's Postgres, and they Postgres is the one that has all your attributes, but Cody is just. But like, what is replication and bypass RLS?
Ah, got it. Okay. So replication and bypass RLS. So bypass RLS is just there's specific functionality that Postgres might be able to stop me from doing. That's bypass RLS, right? So if Postgres tries to stop me from doing something, I can simply utilize a sudo command and say, no, you are going to do this regardless of whatever regulations you have already inside, like you're trying to enforce. And then Postgres will have no other choice but to execute my command because I have that bypass ability. And then replication just means that I'm able to replicate databases. As far as to why you don't have the same permissions, it's when you created the role for your user. For Mac users, when we install Postgres through Brew, it creates us as the main owner of Postgres. For WSL users, when you install Postgres into your machine, it has no ability to create you as the main owner because it's not being installed through Brew. So it only installs one role, which is the default role of Postgres with all of the permissions. You could definitely just alter the role to try to get the remainder of these permissions. But we can talk about how we can set up Postgres in a more efficient manner for you after class, if that works. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, no, it answers my question.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone else have any question? Okay, perfect. This is actually a pretty important part. So I'm going to go ahead and do some rinse and repeat here. And I would like you guys to walk me through connecting Postgres to this app application, right? So I have my Flask server set up. How do I go ahead and connect my Postgres database to this Flask app?
You would use SQL Alchemy.
Okay.
So from Flask _ SQL Alchemy, import SQL Alchemy.
All right. Okay, so now I imported it. How do I use it?
app.config.
Config.
Okay, so I'm adding a configuration. What configuration am I adding here? You guys don't have to remember.
Alchemy. Oh, my bad.
I was gonna say we don't have to remember the exact syntax, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands the steps and concepts as to what's being passed inside of this argument. Because we could always look up the syntax, right? Or the syntax are going to be in our notes, et cetera, et cetera. But I need to ensure that we understand the concepts and steps. So what would go inside here again?
The database URI.
Okay, so I would tell it how to interact with the database, right? So I'm going to tell it, I want you to utilize SQL Alchemy as the database URI. Okay, and what would I set this configuration to?
Would be the location. So Postgres SQL.
Okay, so the type of database, so PostgreSQL. All right.
And then the user.
Okay, so who is entering said database? And in this case, it will be me. So it will be Francisco Avila. All right.
And then I guess it would be considered like the location, so localhost for you.
Since it's within my local machine, it would be a local host. Then I could also specify the port if I wanted to, but the default port that it's going to go to is going to be 5432. So I don't need to change anything there. And then which database am I trying to enter?
Either school or students. I think the database was school and then the table was students, or is that, am I getting it confused?
No, the database is students and the table is student.
Gotcha.
D.
Oh, I was getting confused with the thing we did yesterday with the school and then students. Sorry.
Oh, that makes sense. Awesome. Oh, Cody, thank you for sharing that. For anyone who was wondering, URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. All right. So now I was able to do all of this. And let me just make sure that my app is still running correctly. If I go to run my app, mine's running correctly. The next thing that I need to do is actually be able to grab information from this database. And in order to do that, there's one more thing that I need to install, because now I'm telling it, I'm essentially trying to tell my program that it's going to turn information coming out from a database into something that's Python readable or something that Python can work with. So just like when something comes in JSON and I need to turn it into something that's Python readable by using JSON.loads, whenever I do something from an SQL query to Python, I need to have something to be able to interpret that information. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and install psychopg. So I'm going to go ahead and run pip install psychopg2. For me, it would already be, those requirements would already be satisfied, but for you all, you'll see this being installed. And this is going to allow your program or any Python program in your machine to be able to communicate with a database and interpret those SQL queries into something that's Python readable objects. Okay. So now I have my psychopg2. I've set up my database inside of my SQL query. Well, that's great, but how do I actually start talking to this SQL query? Or how do I actually start building these student objects? Well, here's the next part. I've made all of this information, but now I need something to actually reference the database as. And when I go to reference the database, I'm simply going to pass in the SQL Alchemy class. And I'm going to pass in the app as the argument. I am telling this SQL Alchemy class to take in the app as the argument. It's going to grab the app and it's going to look for this specific spot so that it knows where exactly that database is located. So that anytime I reference this DB variable, which stands for database, it will be interacting with this specific location. That's all that's happening here. I'm just mapping, right? I pass in a configuration to my app to tell her where that database is located. And then I pass in the app to SQL Alchemy so that SQL Alchemy can look within the app, look at this specific setting in it, and find a database so that we can reference it and start working with that information. Any questions so far? There's a lot of linking back and forth, so I want to make sure we understand what's happening. Okay, easy peasy. Let's go ahead and keep going on now. Well, we've worked before with student classes, and we can see here in our prior day on Intro to SQL, we created this class for a student. Well, today we're going to learn about something named models, right? So what is a model? What's its purpose? Well, a model is essentially supposed to be a representation of a data table as a class, right? So we have our data table of what the student should look like. That is here. And we are essentially going to turn this into a Python class in our app. So let me open that up here on the side so that we have it and we can reference it during our lecture. Okay, so how do I do that? Have this DB SQL Alchemy. Let's turn this data table into a Python class. So I'm going to go ahead and name my class student. And that class is going to be referencing the variable DB, which is coming from SQL Alchemy. And I'm going to tell it that this is a model. So now it knows that this class is a model. This is referencing a data table that's coming back from my program. Okay, well now how do I specify these fields? Well, I know I have an ID, and this ID is a column within my class. So I'm going to say, hey, this is an ID. And then I'm going to tell it that it is an integer type. And I'm also going to tell it that it's a primary key by setting it to true. Right? So this here is the equivalent of what we see on line 4. All right? We have an ID. It is a column within my database. It is an integer type, and it is a primary key. Okay, the next part is specifying the first name, which is also a column. So all of these are going to be prefaced by column, right? And this one is going to be a string, just like we had before. And it's going to have 20, just like we had varchar 20. Now this is a string up to 20 characters. And I believe it's exactly the same thing for our last name. So let's copy and paste that and just change the last name portion. Then we have age, which would look something like DB column. That DB column would be an integer. And then finally, a grade, which is a database column that holds a string of 1 character. I just turned this data table into a model that my Python program can now talk to. Does anyone have any questions about how this table turns into a model class? Go ahead, Anthony.
Just out of curiosity, if you were to put like, let's say for first name string, like 15 characters, does that overwrite it or does it just like break it?
Yeah, that's a great question. If the table's already created, it would break it. If the table is not created and this is the first time you're creating the table, then it wouldn't matter. It would create a table with this information and prioritize this over anything that's within Postgres. But since this table is already created within Postgres, we have to make sure that it's matching exactly one by one. Does that answer your question, Anthony?
100%. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions about this?
I noticed.
I actually have one.
Go ahead, Brian, and then afterwards, I think there was someone else who also had a question.
You use a primary key inside the Python, and you use integer, but you use string for both var char and char. Is there any other kind of variance, or other than the variable versus static character, do you pretty much use the same designation?
Yeah, definitely is. We could look into the documentation here for SQL Alchemy. If we scroll down, I think it's here accessible. Let me make sure. It might be easier to look up, but it also accepts something like Boolean, any type of argument that could be passed here. It will also be passed into SQL Alchemy. The only difference is when it comes to varchar and char, when we talk about it in Python terms, they're both still just string, right? So it's able to identify both by just string. But if I had something that was a true or false variable being inserted inside of my data table, then I would have something like db.boolean to be able to pass that information. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Derek?
Is there ever a situation in which you generate your table and read in data on the fly in your application, or is it best practice to already be connecting to an existing table in an existing database?
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically, once you start working into your actual projects, you won't actually write SQL this way, right? You won't create the table first. What will happen is you'll create the model, and then you'll tell your program to utilize this model to create the table. And then that's usually the order of things. So I like to think of it kind of like a sandwich, right? You start off, when you start planning, sorry, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. Let me make sure that I'm answering the question correctly. Whenever you're working into your projects, you're always going to build your model first. Your model will then interact with your database and create a table from that model, not the other way around. Does that answer your question, Derek?
It does. And what would be just like a really brief example of where that data is actually coming from, that you're feeding into your table in your database?
Yeah, so if I had something like this, and then I would still have a CSV file, I would utilize Python dict reader to then run a function that would create an instance of each one of these classes. And then whenever it creates an instance of each one of this model instances, I would save those instances and they would automatically be entered into my database. Does that answer your question? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Fantastic. Go ahead, John.
So let's say you have like an existing table. Does the order matter for the attributes? Like you have ID and then last name, first name, grade, age. Does the order of your attribute matter if you have the existing table?
Yeah, if I have something existing, I would want them to match since the order needs to be the same here, right? So
Got it.
Select all from students, I need to make sure that this order is maintained. So these attributes need to be passed in the same order as the table that created it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Okay, any other questions? Okay, awesome. So now this is working great. But now how do I actually grab that information, right? What does it look like when I try to grab this information? Well, let's see. First, let's make sure that my app is still running. So I'm gonna run Python app.py. Okay, We can see that it's compiling correctly. Everything's going well. It gives me a warning telling me this is a development server. You shouldn't deploy it. Okay, good. But I just made all of this trouble to make this interaction with my database. How do I grab that information? Well, let's say that I want to see all of my students. I'm just going to print something like student. I'm going to reference the model. I'm going to query set model, and I'm just going to grab all. Well, what happens when I do this? Oh, let's see what we have here. Okay, this simply means that you attempted to use functionality that needed the current application to solve this. Set up an application context. Oh. Okay. It may be because it's not within my decorator, so let me move that down here. Okay, so that's working. And let me trigger that print statement real quick. Okay. So now here's what's happening. All right. I was able to run my server, and then I send a request to set server. And here's the request being completed. But up here, we're seeing the student objects. We got student 1, student 2, student 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Now notice that in my list, I only have 5 students. So where are these 6 students coming from?
From the
Your
table in the database that it's referencing, because we added the 6th student yesterday.
Yeah, it's just coming straight from my database, right? If I go to my database, I can see that I have 6 rows, with the 6th one being myself, right? So now all I'm doing here, this is how I'm querying the database. This is the equivalent of select all from student. That's all that's happening here. All right, I created a SQL query utilizing Python. I referenced the student model, so it knows that it's grabbing it from student. I told it that this is going to be a query, so it knows that it's selecting something. And then I just told it to grab all, so it runs the star. So select all from student, grab all from students. Does anyone have any questions about how this worked?
Could I just see your Python class you made?
Of course. Do you have a reference? Do you have a question to it, or is it just?
No, I just missed how you were like setting the attributes, and I see you're using like the DB online from line 7, like the object.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so now I'm able to grab these student objects, but I wonder, what is it that I can do with these student objects? Well, what happens? Notice that whenever I see them all on the list, I'm seeing these arrows and then in kind of a class instance, right? We saw that during OOP. How can I fix this? All right, what if I wanted to see something else? What if I just wanted to
string object or the string dunder or something like that? Maybe
Repper.
one of the dunders.
Yeah, let's try doing something like that. Let's see if we can do something like a dunder method here. I think instead of dunder, I think we want the representation method. And then we would just, let's say we return self dot, and let's just do first name. Okay, I run it, everything's working fine. I go to refresh it, it was completed. And now when we look here, this is still just OOP. Although it's a model, right, that's interacting with my class, all of the attributes or all of the things that we learned during OOP are still apply. We can see that the representation method changed it so that we can grab the first name of this model, right? We see John, Jane, Bob, Emily, Michael, and Francisco, which is the same thing that we have in our SQL queries here. So I know this is working correctly. I know I can give this methods. I can give this class class level attributes. I can give it class level methods, or I can give it instance attributes and instance methods. But at the time, there's no need for any of that. Now, all I want to do is switch up my object so that instead of returning this dictionary information that's being hard coded, it's actually returning something that's coming from my database. So let me go ahead and comment this out. And rather than printing this, let me assign this to students. Okay. So now I'm grabbing it to students and I'm telling it to JSONify it. Well, I wonder what's going to happen when I go to refresh this. I get an error. And it's telling me type error. This object of type student is not JSON serializable. Well, why is that? Right? We saw that we have OOP, and when we create something in OOP and I go to print it out, it's giving me a memory space, right? And that's what it's returning here. It's returning class instances. And it's telling me that a class instance can't be interpreted as JSON. I can't send that over the internet. It just won't work through HTTP, right? So I need to format this query set into something that's acceptable in JSON. So now how can I do that?
We have to make it an object.
Yeah, I could turn them into objects, right? So I could do something like, let's say formatted students is equal to a list. And then I can say for stud in students. I want you to, let's say, formatted students dot append. And what I want to append is going to be a dictionary where the ID is stud.id, where the first name is stud.firstname, and so on. This might take me a while to type out. I apologize, everyone. What's the next thing? Is it age? It is age. Okay, so there you go. So now I created a for loop. It's going to iterate through each one of the students inside of this query set, and it's going to create these dictionaries that I am appending to formatted students. So now all I need to do is change my return value from students to the formatted students. So again, I'm going to go ahead and run this app. I'll go to refresh my GET request. And now we can see that I'm pulling everything straight from my database. I have my age, my first name, grade, ID, and last name, all being grabbed from the database and returned onto my student list, right? So I was able to accept the request. After accepting that request, I talk to my database and I grab all of the students. They're in a query set object, so I can't return that over JSON. So I have to format those students into the proper format. And then afterwards, I can return them as a JSON response. And all of this is covering this portion that we talked about this morning, all right? I accept the request by going over to that address on my browser. After accepting the request, it's talking to the database to grab information from the database. That database returns a query set, and then we're making that query set a JSON readable response that is then returned to the front end. Does anyone have any questions over what we just covered? There's got to be a question. There's no way. There's no questions about this. Come on.
You're always gonna have to format like this when you're passing information, simple information.
If it's something coming from within a query set or some sort of class object, yes, you're going to have to format it. There's an easier way to format it, which we'll learn about later on. But for now, this is the most simplistic way that we can format our information to ensure that it goes back as JSON.
Why does the data come out not in the same order as it is there? Like formatted students list has ID, first name, last name, age, grade, but on the when you look at the results, it's all in a different order.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. If I go to refresh this call, I see that age, then there's first name, then there's grade, and all of this information, right? And it's all mixed up. Well, that's happening because currently right now, the way I'm working this out and the way it's working with this database, it's not guaranteeing me an order. It's guaranteeing me that it's going to be able to grab this information if it exists, but it doesn't guarantee me the order, right? Which is okay. As long as I have the keys and value pairs and they're all nested within the correct data type, it shouldn't cause an issue when I go to access them because I'm just going to utilize .get and I'll go into that specific spot. Now, if I was utilizing something like indexes, it might get in the way. But in this case, since the format is not guaranteed, I have to work with what I have. Does that answer your question, Aaron?
Yep, that'll do it. Thank you, sir.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I was curious, going a little bit back to when you installed, I think it was Psycho PG2. I didn't see in the curriculum anything about that. I was just curious what that was and what it did.
Yeah,
He's right.
That's an excellent question. Yes, that is not in our curriculum, and I'm noticing that downfall right now. I'll make sure to add it. But what Psycho PG2 does is it essentially, let's see, let me grab this. This communication here between the server and the database. So our server is in Python, right? And it needs to be able to make requests to that database in Python. We utilize SQL Alchemy to connect the database to our server, but PsychoPG is what allows our Python to turn into SQL queries and allows the return value from said SQL query to turn into objects or list of objects when returned to Python. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
I have one. When we create this formatted list of students that's a JSON, are we able to return like parsed bits of data the same way that we did yesterday with SQL? Like, is there an easy way to manipulate that on the server? Or do you still need to use the Python commands or run that in your file?
Yeah, so for different query types, you would have to do it here on line 35, right? Rather than utilizing .all, you could utilize something like, let me see if it tells me here. You could utilize something like .filter, and then you could tell it where, I don't know, first name. Let me see if I could do this. Or grade equals A. I think that's what I can do. Oh, nope. That broke it. Let me see if I can hover over it. Okay, got it. So this is going to be student.grade. Oh, it's not working that way. My class.
Wouldn't it be bracket notation?
No, because this is OOP, right? So it goes through dot notation. My class dot name is equal to something. That's what I'm doing. Oh, there you go. Yeah, there it is.
So I could run something like the filter query to be able to grab a grade. There's a couple of other ones, but we're not covering that just yet. We're going to cover that once we go into Django and actually start talking about how Django communicates and creates models and creates SQL queries. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Definitely as well as I can actually play with at this point anyway.
Of course. All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point.